Hey everybody, it's Peter, and this is going to be an interesting one because in this video I'm going to compare the 2023 KLX 230 with the 2023 KLX 230S. Now, the first glance is one shorter than the other, and that's it. And that's what I thought as well. I almost thought it's not even worth making a separate video of these together because, yeah, it's a couple inches shorter. We'll talk about that. But what I found is when you go through the spec sheet, there's a few differences, and then there becomes a few practical differences as well between these two. So these are some things that I think you should consider if you're considering the 230S versus the 230. And in this review, I'll try to give you a full review of who this bike is for, who each of these bikes are for, and talk about those things that the spec sheets aren't showing you. So I'm filming here at Jim Gilbert's Wheels and Deals, Jim Gilbert's Power Sports. This is the #1 volume Kawasaki dealer in the country, and they give me complete access to their entire vehicle lineup. So if you have questions about either of these bikes or anything else in the lineup, make sure you subscribe and let me know in the comments what you want to know about these bikes, about other bikes, and I'll make sure I come back to you both in the comment section and in future videos so we can create a video database of the information that you want about all these vehicles. So let's get going. The first thing we're going to do is talk about a couple little small differences here. I've got my cheat sheet in front of me because I think it's important to talk about more than just the seat height. So seat height, first of all, we're going to go millimeters and inches because the Americans tell me that I'm doing too many millimeters and Europeans tell me that I'm doing too many inches. We'll do both. Seat height on this one, which is the 230, is 34.8 inches, which is 885 millimeters. 32.7 inches over here, 830 millimeters. That's just over 2 inches, 2.1 inches. But we're going to talk about those differences in a second because there's more to it than just that. When you shorten the bike, you're shortening it in the suspension. You're going to create actually a little bit shorter wheelbase, which is something that people don't always expect. The wheelbase is, what is it? Here we go here. Wheelbase is 54.3 over here, 53.5. So it's about an inch shorter wheelbase. Probably not something that's going to make a massive difference, but if you're building up a rack for these kinds of things, there is a different wheelbase just because of the way it's shortened. But we're also going to talk about the weight. Interestingly, the S is actually a slight bit heavier than the non-S, and we're going to talk about wheel travel, ground clearance, and those kind of things, but we're going to talk about how those relate to how you're riding because it may not be what it seems. So let's start jumping on these bikes and talk about some of these things. Let's do that right now. All right, so as I jump on these bikes, a couple things to know. First of all, I am about 6 feet tall, about 175 pounds, and my weight matters right now. We'll talk about that in a second here. I believe I have a 32-inch inseam. I apologize for not knowing that exactly. I think that's about it. So I'm going to jump on the 230 first. Now the 230, I'm a relatively taller rider. And the reason I mentioned my weight is because the difference with a dirt bike over a street bike is twofold when it comes to seat height. First of all, they're measuring the seat at, I assume, its lowest point, but a dirt bike has some compression in that suspension. So when you sit on that bike, you are compressing it down. I am easily flat-footed on here. Now there's two reasons for that. One, the suspension is compressing down, and two, the seat is quite narrow. So here's me sitting on this one, flat-footed. Obviously the distance from the pegs to, I'm gonna put the kickstand up just so I stay perfectly level. Flat-footed there, easy, comfortable. There's kind of me on this bike. Now, you should have a similar rider's triangle on this one over here. So let's just take a look on this one here. Jumping on the shorter version here. First of all, you can definitely feel throwing your leg over. It is more approachable. To me, it feels like it doesn't squat as much, but it probably does. Maybe it does a little bit. And again, rider triangle kind of similar in here. Absolutely lower, you can see with my legs, there's a little bit more of a bend to it, still flat-footed. So let's talk about lowering the seat here between that one and this one, and talk about a few things you might want to consider. I will say this one, even at my height and my weight, feels more approachable, but there's pros and cons to that, and there's a few things to consider because this one actually could give you more ground clearance than that one. It depends on a rider. It's very confusing. Let's make sense of it all right now. So I'm going to pull my cheat sheet in here in a second again, but I think one thing to keep in mind is what Kawasaki is probably assuming with the S model over this. They're probably assuming that not only are you shorter, you're also lighter. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are a heavier rider who has shorter legs, you may want to stay with the 230 here because as you saw, there was good compression there even with my 170 pounds. If you're heavier than me, this may give you the ride height you want without sacrificing ground clearance. And that's something to remember. Don't just shop by looking at the seat height on the website and say, oh, I want the shorter seat height because my inseam is this much, or I'm shorter or taller. It may be the kind of thing you want to sit on because, like I said, a heavier rider will compress this suspension further, and you may end up having the same suspension travel as here. Now, if you are shorter and heavier on here, you have to keep in mind that they're taking away suspension travel in order to create a lower seat height. So while it might be easier to climb onto this one, it may or may not be the best for you to ride. So let me just grab my cheat sheet for a second and we'll talk about a couple of these differences here because I think they really matter to you as a rider. So wheel travel front and rear. The 230 over here, the 230S. For the front wheel, it travels about 8.7 inches here on the suspension. And on this one, it's 6.2 inches. So it's a good bit of difference. Again, it's 220 millimeters to 158 millimeters in front wheel travel. So again, if you're heavier, you're going to compress this down anyways. And if you're lighter, you may not compress this that much. If you have a real heavy rider on here and a light rider on here, you may end up with the same suspension travel either way. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Rear travel over here, you've got 8.8 inches. So we had 8.7 in the front, 8.8 in the rear. This one is 6.2 in the front, 6.6 in the rear. So again, a little bit closer in the rear to that, but very similar. Again, just over a couple inches of travel there. In the rear wheel travel. So you do lose suspension travel. So again, if you're heavier, you're losing suspension travel over here, you're probably better to stay with a taller bike. If you're lighter and you're going to remain lighter, and what I mean by that is if you're a child, this might be good for short term, but if you grow and get heavier, you may lose too much travel and you may want to start with this one anyways. So that's something to consider there. And then we'll talk about ground clearance, 10.4 inches of ground clearance here, 8.3 inches of ground clearance there. So again, if you need a lot of ground clearance, you're going to want to probably stay with this one. But if you're fairly light and you're riding with someone who's fairly heavy, you may end up with the same ground clearance anyways, because like I said, you can see the suspension really compress under my weight. If you're significantly lighter than me, this one's not only going to be easy to manage, it may not compress as much on the suspension, and you may end up with very similar ground clearance between the two. So those are some real key pieces to remember. Short answer is, if you're heavier and you can climb over this one, this still may be the right bike for you. If you're lighter and shorter, this is probably a better option, but that doesn't rule it out for a heavier rider, well, not a heavier rider, but someone like my own weight, 175-ish pounds. If you are primarily on the street, you're gonna find that this feels much more comfortable as a street bike for some people. And again, I'm flat-footed on both, but if you're a little shorter than me and similar weight to me, you may find that this is more approachable. Now, what's interesting is you shouldn't worry too much about weight. Both of these bikes have rear foot pegs, rear passengers, rear strap here. You can take 2 passengers on both these bikes, so you can take extra weight on each of them. But again, there is that suspension difference. So now let's talk a little bit more specifically about these bikes. We're going to zoom in closer and look at some of the features. So we're going to bring you in closer in just a second here, and I've got the 230S in front of me, but let's talk about these bikes. First of all, wheel sizes are the same between these. So when you're crawling over those obstacles and riding over those obstacles, they don't lose wheel size in order to go over obstacles, which is important when you're riding. You want something with the large enough wheels to get over what you're riding. The other thing is, why the 230 versus the KLX 300? Well, there's a couple things. Obviously, the 300 is a little bit more powerful, a little bit bigger. It's also a little bit more expensive. The 230 is the only one in the S model right now as of today when I'm filming this, and that makes it a little bit shorter. So those are 2 options, but there's more to it than just having this S model. This is available with ABS or without ABS, so if you're deciding between those 2, you have to really decide where you're going to be riding the most. If you're doing a lot of in-town, on-street riding, ABS is something I recommend. It just makes it easier to drive, especially as conditions get slippery, and you haven't got fully street tires. So if you consider something like the Ninja 400 with proper street tires versus these on off-road tires, you have a little less rubber on the road with these, and that means if you jam on the brakes, you have a little bit more risk of a slide. ABS is very good for the roads. Now, the reason they offer it without ABS is because if you're driving primarily off-road, sometimes you want to slide out that rear tire or do something like that, and then you need to be able to lock that rear brake up. And if that's the kind of riding you're going to do, you're going to probably want to go with the non-ABS model. The 2 I have today in front of me happen to be non-ABS models, but that's a choice that's up to you. For me, I always like ABS because I find that it doesn't interrupt me enough for the types of off-roading riding that I would do, and it's certainly nice to know that it's there when you're on road. But let's come a little closer now and look at some of the features on this bike as we move through. All right, so we're going to start with the tire and then we're going to move to the engine. When we talk about the engine, I'm really going to get into those differences that may matter to you between the 300 and this, other than speed and power and that kind of thing. But let's just start right here with the tire. First of all, this is a closer to entry-level bike. So on an entry-level bike, you need to balance price with performance. And they do a really good job of this. The suspension fork is not too soft. That's a really common thing in a lot of bikes in this class, that they just make it too soft so it rides great in the dealer parking lot, but it doesn't ride great in the trails. And that's not what you have here. You have something that rides very well for what it does. So they balance that well. You have a 21-inch front wheel. So something like a modern sport bike has a 17-inch wheel. You've got your spokes, which makes it stronger, makes it a little bit able to take bigger impacts and that kind of thing. And these are on off-road tires. They're not full dirt bike tires, which means they are comfortable and safe on the road and legal on the road as well. But they have a pretty good knobbiness to them, so you can really take them off-road. One of the big benefits about this bike is it's going to be very lightweight, easy to maneuver off-road, so you can take the streets to get to the trails. That's really what you're thinking with this bike. You can drive it all day on the roads if you want, but you're really able to go off-road, and does a good job. Disc brake here, like I said, this is not ABS. You can get ABS on this model here. It's all on the other side there, but good strong braking power. Now let's move to that engine and talk about some differences between this and the 300. So taking a look at the engine drivetrain area here, the biggest difference between this and the 300, other than power and price, is that this one is air cooled. And what that means is you don't have a radiator out front that could get punctured. You don't have lines running the coolant from the radiator to the engine. And on a bike like this that you want to have some fun with, and you might be dropping or having sticks ripping across the side of the thing, that is something to consider. There's some extra reliability in having a simple air-cooled engine with less things that can fail out on the trail. So that's something to keep in mind. Yes, you'll have a little bit less power, but again, if you're not going on, interstate highways all the time, that's not a problem. It can go interstate highway speed, but really you're maxing the bike out at that point. So you end up with this. Now, the other thing is, with the lower ride height, both the 230 and 230S still have this engine guard underneath. So again, that lower ride height's only going to matter if you run into something, but you are protected here. So if generally the trails you're riding on don't have massive rocks, massive logs, massive things that you're going over, you'll probably be just fine with the ground clearance on here. You've got good protection down there, and then everything else is simple but durable. Again, steel here, steel there, fold up pegs, all the stuff you expect on a dirt bike. No rubber pegs in this area because you want to have good grip. Your passenger, however, has rubber pegs. Now, if you think about the passenger, they're probably only coming with you on the road on smoother traveled areas. So you're not going to bottom out your suspension and go off-road on this bike. You're going to take them on the road. So they have some vibration resistance, whereas you have some off-road, on-road ability here with the good grip on the pegs that also clear mud very well. So good design here for what it's designed to do. A little bit of a heat shield in this area here of the header pipe there. And of course, exhaust tucks in up there like a dirt bike. So simplicity is the key with the 230. So taking a look at the dash of the 230S, again, same exact dash as on the 230. You turn it on there, you have a nice digital dash. Now you have a proper fuel gauge here, so simple fuel gauge, a clock. You have a speedometer there, an odometer down the bottom, and then you have options here. You can switch through trip A, trip B, and that's it. Or over here is your reset button, and that is it. Some people think this is a gear indicator. It's not. This is actually the same exact dash as on the KLR, which is kind of interesting. You can see some warning lights over here. The bike's not running, so your engine light's flashing right now. If there was an ABS version that I was filming, you would see an ABS light. Got a high beam light there, which we can turn off, and a neutral light. Let's just show you the controls on this bike as well, and we'll back up to that right now. Taking a look at the left side controls, pretty simple stuff here. You have your high beam, your low beam, you have your signal lights on and off. They're incandescent bulbs on this bike, so if you were to drop it, they're simple to replace, not very expensive or anything. And then you've got your horn down there. On the road bikes, there's a little flash to pass on the high beam. You don't have that here. Again, it's all about simplicity and durability. Again, nice simple grips here as well. Also the mirrors we should point out, let's just scroll slightly up to them. Simple round mirrors. Again, these are about inexpensive to replace type things. They work very fine, they work very well, they're positioned well, but again, you're looking at stuff that if you were to drop this bike, becomes very simple to replace. Let's scroll across the handlebar. 45 degrees of turn on each of these handlebars, so 45 degrees each way, which means it's a sharp turning bike. It is a little darker over here. Let's just zoom right in there. The only thing you have on the throttle side here is the kill switch. Again, easy to reach, the throttle, oops, and the start button. Better not start that up right now. We'll leave that off right now. So again, start button, kill switch, simple stuff over here, and that's really the key. The other thing I like about the switches, both the headlight switch switch, the kill switch. They're large and clunky, which means they're easy to turn on and off even with gloves on. Even if you get dirty or muddy, no problem, easy to operate. So now let's talk about who these bikes are for, but more specifically, let's talk about who should buy one over the other. The S model is not just for shorter riders. If you are a newer rider, a dual sport bike or a street and trail bike are very popular first bikes. They're inexpensive to buy, they're simple to maintain, they kind of last forever. When you get new ones, you can get ABS. You don't have to worry if somebody's changed the oil or not. You have, buying a new bike saves you from a lot of hassles of poor ownership and abuse from other people. If you are someone who's my size and you're learning to ride and this isn't going to be your forever bike, and if your off-road riding consists of mainly dirt roads or normal light trails, not heavy-duty off-road, the S might be something you want to consider because it's a little bit closer to a street riding height, which makes it less intimidating. It still turns 45 degrees to the left, 45 degrees to the right, right and left. I mixed up my left and right there. But you end up with something that's very approachable, very comfortable. And like I said, if you're heading down just dirt roads or rougher roads or mild trails that aren't like crazy trails, this might be something that's more comfortable for you, more practical for you, and might make more sense for you. So that's an option on a newer rider. Now, if we're going to talk about a newer rider who's going to spend maybe a little more time on the street than anything else, I'm going to use the other bike because it's aimed a little better. I should point out that both of these have a nice LED headlight. So let me just turn the key on here. We'll turn the headlight towards the camera there, and we'll flash the high beam up here. So you've got an LED light and an LED high beam on both of these. So the reason that that's important is twofold. One, an LED light is often brighter, but the second thing is that an LED headlight is closer to daylight in color. And when you're going on the street and the trail, you're going to be coming around tighter corners, that kind of thing, and maybe you'll see something that you can't tell if it's a rabbit or a rock or a raccoon or a rock or something like that. The LED light, because it's brighter and because it's closer to daylight in color, helps your brain, which is used to seeing things in daylight color, identify things quicker. So it's a great light to be seen on because some dual sport lights in the past were pretty dim compared to the street bikes. This one is good to be seen. And the other thing is, from a vibration point of view, driving over aggressive terrains, you don't have a filament in here the same way you would with the headlight bulbs, which means it's a little bit more durable for the types of riding that you might want to do. And that's a nice upgrade to have in 2023. So let's talk about why you would maybe want this one. First of all, if you're taller or heavier, even if you're shorter, you may want to have this bike just so you can maintain some of that suspension travel once you sit on it. Don't be too intimidated by seeing tall seat heights in a spec sheet, especially on a street and trail or dual sport bike. As you get on these, they are going to compress a little bit. That's the way the suspension is designed. But again, if you're heavier, you don't want to give up too much ground clearance. You want to stay on probably the taller bike, and that's something worth considering. Basically, what's the key point of having these bikes? They're super durable, they're simple. Electric start, air-cooled, simple stuff. If you drop them, they're designed like a dirt bike. All the panels are flexible, so you don't have to worry about cracking a panel like you would on something like a Ninja 400. And you can have a lot of fun, whether you're learning on it, whether it's a secondary bike, whether it's your only bike that kind of does a little bit of everything. These are great options, and now that they're available in 2 ride heights, you have some choices. So let me know in the comments below what you think. If you've owned either of these two, let me know what you think about what it's like to ride. And if you have questions, make sure you tell me in the comments below, because like I said, I'm not afraid to come back to these bikes again and again to make sure we make more videos to create an information database for you to understand more. And I want to thank everybody for watching. If you're in Fredericton area, New Brunswick area, make sure you swing by Jim Gilbert's Wheels and Deals. They've got both of these bikes in stock. They've got a massive showroom. Like I said, Canada's #1 volume Kawasaki dealer. There's a reason that people buy bikes here instead of somewhere else. So make sure you swing by, give them a chance, and we'll talk to you in the next one.